Numela Darse Locheni Salbona Nda Tobela Molo Avusheni. Hello and welcome to this webcast brought to you by the Red Zone and Financial Mail and MNC Saatchi Group South Africa. A very interesting conversation awaits us as we talk all things connections and conversations live with you right now. We know that the media landscape is evolving with substantial shifts in earned and paid media. Earned media increasingly resides on digital platforms, with UGC taking a leading position and influencer marketing really, some would argue, distracting audiences from editorial integrity. Paid media, more conversely, is becoming more data-centric, employing programmatic advertising and analytics for precision. However, ad avoidance is also emerging as a challenge, and to navigate this complex, changing terrain, agencies and clients need to understand how to effectively use both, placing emphasis on integration, authenticity, the most overtraded word of mankind, and quality content that captures and retains attention. In this webcast, we're delving into these dynamics and delivering practical insights to help you remain competitive in the evolving digital marketing realm. I'm Arya Kelman, and the panel we have is unprecedented, helping us dive into this topic. Joining us is partner and managing director at Razor PR, Dustin Chick. Marvin Khalsane is the managing director at MNC Saatchi Connect. And when you think media, you 100% think of this thought leader. It's Katie Katapodis, media thought leader. All right, we've got very different perspectives on the call this morning. We have PR, we have paid, and then we have the actual editorial. Now, Katie, we chatted a couple of days ago, and you told me that you come in from a vantage point of the news cyclone, because there's actually just too much to see, too much to engage with. Before we even put the branded lens onto this with Dustin and Marvin about trying to sell things, the world we woke up in this morning, there's just too much to see and digest, right?
Absolutely, Aria. Thank you so much. Everybody calls it the news cycle. I love to call it the news cyclone, because that's essentially what it is for us, and not just in South Africa, but the world over for journalists. So we've got the cyclone of stories and news and happenings and events that is just sweeping us all up, and particularly as journalists. And of course, I speak from the vantage point of a newsroom and from an editorial vantage point. But essentially what the cycle does is it comes in, it sweeps you up. And what it means for us as editors who are running diary meetings, who are running diaries every day, is that there is so much on the go. Whether you are dealing with the latest in the Middle East, whether you've got a book fever that's really just going nuts in the country, there's a lot to do. And so you've got to think very strategically as the leader of a newsroom in terms of how to navigate this news space, because as much as we'd love to, we can't cover everything. As much as we would love to have unlimited resources, as much as we would love to have teams absolutely everywhere, we simply cannot. So we need to think strategically about what we're going to cover, how we're going to cover it. And of course, that's very closely linked to our audiences. Not all editorial guides and decision-making processes are the same, because we've all got very, very different audiences. What do our audiences want? How do they want their news? Be it broadcast or be it print, be it digital. So we need to think very carefully about this flurry of news that is constantly on the go, what we cover it, how we cover it, and then what we give our audiences, what they need from us, because nobody can cover everything all the time. It is financially impossible.
It's impossible. Dustin, you invited me to a memorial the other day for the press release that everybody's sending Katie, expecting her to somehow find time in her day to cover. So when we try and start interjecting a brand context into what Katie's describing as this cyclone, that now feels incredibly challenging, because we're barely struggling even to tell the actual news, never mind trying to put a brand lens on it. So when it comes to the state of kind of PR, earn, all those terms in a 2023 context, how do you even start a call with Katie to get you to care?
I think it starts with the story. And I think if you're thinking press release or infographic or whatever it might be, you're thinking channel. And that already means that you're coming at it from your vantage point. So the quickest divide that we would need to cross in a conversation that Katie and I would need to have would be, how is the story I want to tell relevant to the story she would tell to her audience? So it implies I understand her channel, her audience, the market around her, but also that I understand where that story fits into the story of the day. And it's an ability to read the room to a large degree, but also to be able to understand that if I can't connect those dots, really what I'm doing is just spraying and praying. And I'm hoping that a story is going to stick with Katie. There's many times I've phoned her and said, I have this random story. What do you think? Sometimes she says yes. Mostly she just laughs at me. And the reality is that when you want to play in this new, harder earned world, because it is harder, there's less channels to earn your space in. There's less attention on the stories that you want to tell in this, and they don't last as long within the cycle that you typically would have seen before. If you can't connect the dots to what's actually happening around you, you have no story to tell.
Marvin, let's bring you in. When Dustin says things like spray and pray, I have a feeling that's what a lot of challenging clients perhaps come into your office and say, this idea of storytelling, I'm just trying to sell a product, let's just put this thing everywhere. But if I'm understanding the kind of paid space correctly in 2023, creative efficacy, which would be a result of storytelling, is actually what is an empowering tool in getting that paid media to yield some form of ROI. So is Spray and Pray gone as well? Are they having a memorial alongside the press release?
I wouldn't call it as much as a memorial. I think the Spray and Pray has its place, but I think the question we've been really obsessing about over the last 8 months is really, and asking our clients, interrogating them specifically, is about, are the people that they're trying to reach really getting the message, right? I think there's been a study that's shown when ads don't meet the attention memory threshold of 2.5 seconds, it's really hard for that mental availability to grow. Research was done across more than 130,000 online ads across 1,100 brands, and 85% of those don't reach that 2.5 second threshold, which is a lot of wastage. The consumer is increasingly distracted, and where our focus now has been is really about gaining that attention as well as impact. Reach is no longer enough. So the spray and pray approach is definitely not the key silver bullet for any marketing campaign anymore. So that's been really the focus from our side, attention being our obsession.
Katie, keep me real here. Can a brand really have by the time they come to you, can it be a positive story, right? Can this thing actually happen? Can a brand have a positive story that relates to kind of something that's happening in our real world? Can they feature in the news in a positive way? Is that even a possible thing?
I do think it's possible, but I think what Dustin said is critical. They've got to be able to read the room. They've got to be able to understand the relevance, and they've got to fit quite naturally into a news cycle. And these, Aria, are very hard asks. These are not easy. I think it takes a very, very skilled brand and marketing expert to be able to do that properly. And in fact, there was something that happened this week which did make us think, oh, that's a nice news story, but it was very brand driven. And I don't know if I can mention it.
No, go for it.
So we saw that Hollard changed their name to Pollard. Yes. They did that very funky, and that was really great because it fitted into the psyche of a nation, and suddenly we could do a story to say, not only are South Africans just getting behind the box, but actually you've got companies that have gone as far as changing their logos and their branding and their corporate IDs. So that does become a news story to a degree, because that was, in my mind, really, really well done. It's not always possible. Sometimes brands try too hard, and sometimes they're just not going to get the mileage that they were hoping for, because the story itself is not about the brand. It's not about any branding. The story itself is just far too complex in many ways. And we know that South Africa, particularly when we look at our front pages and our lead stories, very, very difficult stories that we're dealing with. Challenging times for us as a country. There's no doubt about that.
I can see Marvin itching, because a piece that Hollard do like that is effective because they've kind of built a narrative of being sort of quite tapped into some form of human insight and some form of human truth. And I know that, Marvin, you've done some work with Hollard in terms of just showcasing and the brand showing up in a different kind of way to establish a narrative that a Katie, who's a incredible sort of journalist icon in South Africa, looks at that and thinks, oh, cool, that's cool, and it didn't come out of nowhere. So maybe talk to me about establishing that narrative that a year later, Katie sees something and it doesn't feel that far-fetched.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think Hollard is such a perfect example because their belief is all about shared success. If you're doing well, we're all doing well, right? And one of the campaigns that we had worked on with them was the Big Ads for Small Business campaigns, where we literally gave away our advertising space to 12 other businesses, small businesses, to help them in a time where they could secure better futures for them. So bearing in mind that, COVID lockdown was 1,309 days ago, it really was an impactful moment. And, for them to have showed up in the way that they did in trying to help small businesses, critical to their success was how we had actually optimized the media plans against each of those audiences. So each business had to speak to a different audience. So the real key insight for us is how we worked with Hollard to identify those audiences and then created bespoke media plans. And of course, the results in terms of campaign performance were absolutely phenomenal. So definitely, Hollard is definitely one of those brands that's close to my heart personally.
So it's super interesting because you think insurance and you think insurance can't have this effect. And you probably think that because Dustin's probably sat in countless meetings like this, where the client genuinely believes that the premium being 5% less is a newsworthy story and should be on the front page of a newspaper. And that's perhaps the elephant in the room that we need to speak about for a second is the client understanding that something that they sort of eating, sleeping, breathing all day, which is a 5% decrease on the premium, well, they're kind of the only one that really cares about that and thinks that it's super newsworthy. So Dustin, talk to me about striking that balance in terms of having honest conversations around what it takes to get to a point of earned with the client. I think just to unmute there.
Sorry. You would think that we get that right after 1,000 days of COVID. It's a fascinating question because it actually speaks fundamentally to the core of what makes things work from an earned point of view and what doesn't. And that lives really in two places. The first one is the relationship between the agency and the client around having the hard conversation around what's going to make this thing actually a story. So for the client to be married to this whole 5% concept is right. It's what they're living and breathing. It's a key part of their business strategy, their business success, and it's our job to make that a story in a way that is more relevant and more compelling. The danger comes is when the client believes that inviting someone to the opening of an envelope is the story, and we haven't done the work to turn into something that is more meaningful. So it starts with a hard conversation. The hard conversation is, why does a 5% reduction in premium matter? Well, it matters at a time where cost of living is through the roof, where insurance, which is traditionally a grudge purchase, is increasingly on a buy down trend. So people are shopping to reduce premium, sometimes for the wrong reasons. They take a reduced premium, but they don't see what the excess looks like on the back end, and actually it's bad financial decision making on their part. But they see the debit order on their bank account is a lot less. So the first point of departure is we understand the story. The story is actually where consumers find themselves and their relationship with their costs on a monthly basis and how they treat those costs. The second one is, where do those conversations take place? Do they take place on a social platform? Do they take place in forums and groups? Are they taking place in Katie's newsroom? And if it's taking place in Katie's newsroom, what is the nature of the story relative to the viewers or listeners or readers of that newsroom, so that the story then makes sense to them? Then you have to decide, is a 5% reduction in a premium a short-term story or a long-term story? So what's the strategy? Because there's a big discussion here around positioning. Are we positioning the product, or are we positioning an organization with a commitment to a future? That fundamentally changes the nature of the story again. So it's being able to work with clients and go, let's actually unpack this thing. Let's unpack this thing in a way that we can seek for relevance. And then we can have the conversation around where and how and what to package it on. And we can package it short, medium, and long term to actually give that 5% some legs. If we just focused on the 5%, it would be a press release. It would go a little bit okay, maybe in some trade media and some personal finance media, and it would fall off the cliff probably the next day. And that just says that the orientation on telling that story was flawed. It was flawed because it was actually about us. It wasn't about the people we're ultimately trying to talk to. And I think when you start to have those conversations and the nature of those conversations with people, you fundamentally change what the outcome of an earned result looks like. And then you can get creative, and you can get very creative around how to package those places and where to put those places and what things that brands can actually create with an earned intent in mind. So what is naturally content producing? And then it's a conversation between Marvin and I around what does earned and paid look like in this world where we're looking to create volume and scale for the story in a way that's purposeful and deliberate, as opposed to just a couple of shots in the dark and we just threw money at the problem. And then it's about the conversation with Katie saying, does this new story around cost of living and what corporates are doing to respond to the cost of living have resonance to you? I would recommend that it probably does.
Challenge, however, I guess comes in when the brand is trying to run the questions that Katie's going to ask through compliance, and Katie's saying that's just not how we work here. So talk to me for a second, Katie, around brands learning and cultivating the ability to trust what's going to happen when they go into that kind of space. Because for any FSP, I mean, we've used the idea of insurance here. To get one of their executives, Dustin can do the best job in the world at saying that this is the right sort of story to tell. But someone somewhere is going to send an email saying, can I get the list of questions? Can I review this before it goes out? And how does one begin to shift that mindset? And what happens if you don't shift that mindset and you don't try and be a part of the conversation when Dustin and the team are giving you all these amazing ways in which to do so?
So it's so interesting because I think that brands, particularly executives and particularly the comms teams that are putting the executives out to do these interviews, need to really understand that, sure, you may want to, as an FSP, talk about your 5% premium increase. But the reality is that once you're in that journalist space, you're in their space. We may not necessarily give you all the questions you want. In fact, it's highly unlikely. We can kind of give you a theme. We can say to you, yes, this is broadly what we're talking about. But the reality is that any question can come your way. So if you're going to do an interview, be prepped for it all. Be prepped for everything. Be prepped for the most difficult question that you don't want to answer. And if you're ready to answer that, your interview is actually going to be better, because then I think then you are fully prepared. So going into this, unless it's paid for, by the way. So if you've got a paid for, then you know that you've got full and absolute control of the questions. You've got control of the direction of the interview. But that doesn't happen in earned media, where you've been invited in as a guest, where you're doing this interview with a journalist. The conversation can go in any direction. And I think the onus there is on the comms teams and on the executives of these brands to understand that, and then to be able to navigate that without falling apart live on air, without crumbling, without becoming hostile, and without ruining that relationship.
Even in the context, Marvin, of, say a brand, it's too much for them, right? And they're rather going to buy the editorial. We see these time and time again. They're going to kind of curate what they say. They're going to have full control over it. It's too nerve-wracking to allow the executive to have a one-on-one with Katie, even though she's fantastic. There's still something to be said around, and we've spoken about this from the beginning, kind of this creative efficacy and what this is, because you can say all the right things in the editorial, but you have to make people care, whether it's earned or it's owned or whatever it is. How are we doing as a media and marketing industry about truly getting people to care, or is buying media still very much a tick box exercise?
Look, I think, there's a few factors we need to consider. What a lot of marketers have moved away from is really just following the four principles, right? Talking about the right message at the right time, what are the right outcomes? So essentially, if we are to understand all of that, I think our media across ATL as well as digital would do a better job at, being effective in terms of that messaging. One thing that we also quite strongly believe in is about context understanding. How do we then profile these audiences, understand how they behave and how they're consuming these different platforms? And that will allow us to actually pinpoint specific areas as to where we can start targeting and making these messages become a little bit more impactful as to where they are at the moment. So that's really my take.
Now, whether the story lives as a billboard or it lives as a news piece, the other word that's come into our sort of ether in the past couple of years with the advent of social has been this idea of engagement. So now the audience is going to speak back at me based on what I'm saying. And now there's 1 million people reached, but there could be 1 million comments on what it is that I'm saying. When we sort of get to the space of the news piece has now aired, the brand has shown up in a really purpose-led way, and the response is either negative or positive. When it comes to cultivating that engagement and taking it to build something, how do you build momentum around engagement after a story has gone live, after it's been weaved in? How do you keep that going, even if the brand manager changes, Dustin?
I think the first very important thing is to give up on the illusion of control. Because if you want engagement that is entirely controlled, I don't know if that really exists on any platform. So take just a social platform, Facebook. I'll give away my age. As an example, is the engagement will not be entirely positive. In fact, that's okay, because it means it's real. It also gives you a good sense of where your brand is showing up and the conversations that people are having on and about you, which you have choices to engage or not engage. So it comes down to the appetite for the brand, and I know you said it's an overtraded word, but this authenticity thing. But actually, I'd go even a step further and say it's the genuineness of what a brand is trying to achieve. Now, when you look at the positive, the neutral, and the negative around any engagement, most of it's going to be neutral. It's the fundamental reality of most people's engagement. And it's a function of that news cyclone. It's just too much. So people are quite surface level on a lot of stuff. When you look at engagement at a positive and a negative level, you have to benchmark those things. So we would look at about 10% at a negative. More than 10% on a negative level is a bit of an issue. And less than 25% on a positive level is a little bit of an issue. So you can then actively manage within those communities to seek ways to manage up or manage down in terms of those things, by actively engaging them. Now, clearly in the negative, where there's a sociopath, racist, misogynist individual, that's an outlier, and that requires your house rules to be able to manage that on a basis. And chances are someone like that's comments would be removed or hidden. Someone like that would be bounced from the page. But your house rules will give you the rules in terms of what that is, because that speaks against, for example, the brand's values. But someone doesn't have to agree with you in that, and we should welcome that disagreement, because obviously what it is it actually an effort by someone to understand your point of view. And I think that's the critical part. Does your organization have a point of view on which it is willing to publicly engage? And I think this is where it gets tricky, because I think a lot of organizations are quite nervous of that point of view. They're quite keen to sit on the fence. They're quite keen to, at the risk of maybe repeating myself, being a bit vanilla in how they see the world. But the expectation of you and me when we take off our marketer's hat and we're just normal people. And is that we do have a point of view. So when we were chatting the other day, I said that I did the straw poll recently when I spoke at the IMC, and I asked everybody in the room who had a point of view around load shedding to put up their hand, and the whole room put up its hand. And then I said, for those of you whose organization has a point of view on load shedding, keep your hands in the air. And only, I would say, less than a third of the people's hands stayed up. And there's this weird kind of cognitive dissonance between how we think as people and how we think our organizations must think. And the question then I would want to ask is, why would it be wrong for an organization to have a point of view around load shedding? Because it's a fundamental reality of their operations. And if it wasn't, what la-la land are they living in? And understanding that, and then using that as a basis to say, I can engage, because I'm real and I'm relevant and I'm current and I'm informed and I'm all those things, that actually means that when people come to me on those channels, they're going to have the conversation with me. You know, that engagement thing we talk about? Engagement isn't they clicked like. The engagement is they engage. The clue's in the name, in how they put it together. And I think that's where the big divide comes, is where the brands and the organizations, and often brand managers and comms people, have to have a little bit of bravery to say, I'm going to engage in the world around me, because it means I show up in a way that says my audience says, they get it. They're actually real.
I can see Katie itching to weigh in on the brand manager looking at themselves in the mirror and figuring out their POV for their organization. Tell me about this POV piece, Katie.
Well, Arya, where I want to come in is to say nothing will irk an editor and a journalist more than a brand that is your friend when it suits them. Than a brand that wants to develop a relationship, but only on their terms. So that is deeply problematic for me as a journalist. So it's all good and well to do a great piece, a great piece when something works well, but when there's trouble in paradise, and when we do want to come to you for an interview that is quite hard-hitting and get a level of accountability, then suddenly you're not available. Then suddenly you don't want to talk. Then suddenly you lean on this, but we've got a relationship, can't you leave it? That's nonsense. That's absolute rubbish. Because that's not how the relationship between a journalist and an organization or a brand works, actually. And this is what brands and marketers and executives really need to understand. We're not only here for the good weather days. We're not only here when we're friends. But you need to have a strategy then. What happens when things go wrong? Don't reject my call. Don't tell me no comment. Don't just ignore us, because that's deeply problematic for us. And ultimately, we're going to go on air irrespective, or we're going to print and publish, irrespective of our relationship, with a story that essentially says so-and-so was unavailable for comment or refused to comment, but this and this is what we have. So I think that's a very important point that I just wanted to make, because it can't be a one-way relationship. And we know that when things go wrong, people want to and love to blame the media, but actually we also need to be quite introspective and look at what's gone wrong within our organization as well. And if there's a case to be answered, come up with a strategy and answer it.
Marvin, this is hard for marketers, though, who are conditioned to work in cycles. They are trying to push life insurance. They've got a great relationship with Katie. They've got a 6-week campaign to do it. That's the focus of the business. For those 6 weeks, they shoot the lights out. 3 months later, something happens in the life insurance space. Katie's saying, this is a negative story. We need you to comment. They're like, well, I've moved on to pet insurance now. That's the new focus. So talk to me about kind of this sort of campaign to campaign mentality that brands need to now adopt. I mean, it feels quite like kind of always on. But the idea that you can't just put an ad out for 6 weeks and that's what we talk about, and then we talk about the next thing. The idea of, if you want to be in tune with the news, you have to be in tune with the news. Yeah, no, true. And I think, one of the benefits of integrating both the PR side and the media side, the paid media side, is that it creates a robust marketing strategy that combines immediate impact in terms of what we need to sell over that 6-week period with long-term growth. And that's where Dustin and his team comes in. Not always an easy task with certain of the other brands, but just to go back to the point Dustin was making around brands having points of view and that being impactful, I wanted to bring it home for our viewers in terms of the brands that we represent. And one of them that do it very well is Nando's specifically.
how relevant they are, how on the mark they are in terms of authenticity, or the word that Dustin used was genuineness. And that for me is really what makes it more compelling in terms of the content that they're putting out there.
Dustin, I know you want to close out this thought for us. Go for it.
I think it's the light and the shade. And I think that's where that campaign mentality sometimes stands in our way, because the world doesn't exist in 6-week sprints. It feels like it does, because we're so conditioned to it. But the reality is it really, really doesn't. And we need to have, I guess, on agency side, the courage and the bravery to work with our clients to really drive this home. But even on the marketer side is to understand that in the world we live in, we show up as a whole thing, not just as the 6-week thing. And we don't get to choose the portion of us which wants to shine. And that's real long-term brand building, if you think about it, building the whole. And then in balancing that light and the shade is to understand what stories are inside that 6-week window and what stories are outside of that 6-week window. And maybe they happen at the same time. And that's also okay. Because people don't only engage you on the topic that you're busy with. And genuine organizations and have genuine conversations engage on the things that people engage them on at the time they engage them on it. And I think it's a little bit of just getting over ourselves a bit, and finding a way to balance that noise in that universe. And it means that sometimes when the hard questions come, that you can answer them because we are genuine and we are engaged and we get the balance in the light and the shade, and we have the work and the proof points and all of those things within inside our organizations that says we can address the things that come our way because that's who we are.
As Dustin's speaking, I'm just hearing the adage of it's PR, not ER, because these things feel like the end of the world for a brand for some reason. This morning, we're talking connections and conversations. We're live right now on the Red Zone and the Financial Mail. It's brought to you by MNC Saatchi Group South Africa. We still have quite a bit of conversation to cover. On the line with us is Dustin Chick, partner and managing director at Razor PR, Marvin Khalsane, managing director at MNC Saatchi Connect, and Katie Catapodis, media thought leader. I want to speak for a second about the engagement piece and come back to that, because it is a bit of a drug, right? If you're the person that put that Pollard post out, I guarantee you right now, you're thinking to yourself, well, what can I do this weekend on Monday? Because this got such a positive response. And I mean, I guess it would be interesting to get a kind of journalist perspective on it, because you want to get the noteworthiness and you want to get the story and you want to almost, I guess in a journalistic context, the more sensational you are sometimes, the more you think it's going to yield. But how do you start kind of not finding engagement as this never-ending pit and consistently seeking it? When do you kind of find the light and shade in engagement, Katie? And this probably draws on a little bit of clickbait stuff as well.
So, I think it also comes down to expectation, Aria. You can't expect because you had one fantastic moment and suddenly, Hollard became Pollard and everyone loved it. It's got to be, I know you hate this and I know you said it's overused, but it actually does have to be authentic. And it's got to almost have like a life of its own that grows, and it mustn't look as if it's manufactured, because we don't want this manufactured story at all. And the reality is, let's think about the box and let's think about this particular example. You are up against a lot. So for you to actually make it on Sunday or Monday, whether we win or lose, as a brand, as a marketer, as an agency, it's got to be shit hot, because otherwise I don't think it's going to happen. You are up against a lot. And from a news perspective, we're going for the news angles. That's our priority. That's our obligation to our viewer, our listener, and our reader, to give them the actual news. So we're going for the angles that talk about, obviously, the victories, the losses, the reaction, the captain, the coach, what's the president saying, where is the Minister of Sports, Arts and Culture? I mean, I saw a fascinating yet laughable comment. The president said if we win, he'll declare Sunday a public holiday. Well, Sunday public holidays are always carried over to the Monday. So let's be clear if we're getting Monday off. But these are the newsy angles that we're going to chase. So, I think you've got a hard task ahead of you if you even think you are going to make it into that news cycle as an agency, brand, or marketer on a day like Sunday, just after a World Cup, a historic World Cup final, win or lose. I mean, we're obviously going to say win, but the reality is win or lose. Sure, it's highly unlikely in my mind.
And yet all the copywriters have probably been briefed to come into the agency on Sunday to find something.
Yep.
Marvin, you're not the guy briefing the copywriters, right? You don't have the out of home ready for them to load the copy on Sunday, especially after what Katie said.
Well, Arya, that's a good point, though, is because, and that's why we've been obsessed about it. It's about the attention moment, right? We know that 62 million South Africans come this weekend, they're going to be distracted across the board. So what are the attention moments that we need to be planning against? And those are looking out for the competitor tactics and pressure points, and where's the open space that we can play in. So it's a key critical stage for us. And if you are not thinking about this attention moment over this weekend, you're losing out on a massive opportunity to actually be the one we speak about on Monday.
Katie, the attention moment, I know you want to build. Katie loves an attention moment. Every day is an attention moment.
I do. I do. Because I also think you obviously want the attention moment, but be clever about it. You're not going to get the attention on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. But you know what? Maybe Wednesday, maybe Thursday, maybe Friday. The story has, as we say in newsrooms, this story has legs. And we're always looking for new angles to keep it alive. So just a little tip there, Marvin, for your copywriters, for everyone, for your clients, is to go, don't obsess about the first 2-3 days. That's unless it's just unbelievably brilliant. It's not going to have. Think about the space that is then created afterwards. Find your moments and understand how media works. You know, I always say you need to understand how journalists think. You need to understand how newsrooms function, and knowing, and also how diary processes function and how the diary works. Knowing that will help you a lot. I mean, I don't know, I'm giving away some trade secrets here, but I think it's important because you are then finding a space that's not perhaps in that minute, because from a news perspective, you're not going to get it anywhere. I'll put my head on a block for that. But the next 3, 4, 5 days, maybe a week later, you never know if it's clever enough, if it's brilliant enough, and if there's an action potentially behind it, it could be fantastic. Because you've also then given us a lifeline. Arya, you've given us a lifeline because you've got journalists who are pulling their hair out. They're going, oh, my editor wants me to keep the box story alive. And I actually don't know. I'm boxed out. We've exhausted all the angles. I don't know what to do. In my inbox, I see something then that's relevant. I go, oh my word, that may actually be my next angle on the story. I'll keep my editor happy.
Dustin, this is such restraint, though, that Katie's talking about. I mean, is this restraint even achievable on client side?
Yes, and absolutely it should be. And I think the interesting question is not what is my one-liner and how am I going to make that news. But the more important question, or the more critical question, is what is the news? And can I be part of it? And I know it sounds like a little gentle paraphrase into it, but it is a completely different switch in orientation. Because then it says, what can I do that is newsworthy, because I understand there's a need to keep the story alive. I understand that winning the World Cup will be a big defining moment in terms of where we are as a country right now at a social cohesion level, never mind just what brands are doing. And how can I show up in that moment in a way that people go, you get it? So actually the brief to the copywriters is a little bit nuanced, and the brief to the media guys is a little bit nuanced, and the brief to the PR guys is a little bit nuanced. But if you go there and you go there well, you will show up well. It's that old, how do you become part of something? Well, you choose to do so. And I think that's a really important way of understanding just how to become part of a news cycle, is appreciating that that's what it is. And I think otherwise you start to bang your drum like everybody else, and then you will be just like everybody else.
And I mean, in a South African context, I mean, we've got no shortage of things to have a sentiment about. You don't have to do it the day after. I mean, I know that there's a great reference in terms of some of the work that Raz has done with Tiger Brands, which taps into something we all do every day, regardless of if it's a World Cup or not, which is eating and how we eat. And that's a consistent always on. Someone will always want to lose a few more kilos. Someone will always want to eat a little healthier. So, when you get insights and nuggets like that, and an insight around how South Africans might eat may not be the top news story, but you can take that and you can make it something, and it is a little timeless, right, Dustin?
It is, and timely, and I think that those are important things to understand. So the work we did for Tiger was founded off an appreciation that there had not been a national nutrition study of South Africans in well over a decade. And here we found ourselves in COVID, where the talk of the day was banana bread. But what was the health impact of that banana bread? Do we understand what that was doing to South Africans eating? But actually, during COVID, did we understand what their psychology of eating was actually about? Either at an adult level or a child nutrition level, even within healthcare professionals who were at the front line of dealing with what we didn't know anything about. And what you have to do then is transition between this understanding of the very typical reduced salt, fat, and sugar within diets, but actually understand how those things translate into real behaviors. And the insight there is that there isn't likely a pantry anywhere in this country, in someone's kitchen or home, that doesn't at least have a Tiger product within it. And that's deeply important, because it means that we need to show up as an organization in a way that means we understand our audiences well, and the impact that we have on their lives. So we took the research, which was a full qualitative and quantitative study around eating and nutrition behaviors. It was run over a 2-year cycle. So it was deeply sampled and deeply made sure that there was a lot of rigor behind the data, and that we could turn that data into something meaningful. But then it's that old storytelling thing. The data wasn't about salt reduction. The data was about, here's the recipe, which is high impact, high taste, high nutrition, low salt. Because how do you actually cross the divide between telling someone they have to reduce salt intake? It feels like we've wallpaper. We've all heard that message before. Versus giving them the practical thing, which is the actual recipe. And how do you turn that recipe into content, which is either showing up in an owned place, so within your own channels, or in an earned place where our consumers are shopping and buying. And then talking to the likes of Marvin's team and saying, how do we give that legs? And how do we make sure that it's showing up in the right hands so that we are influencing behavior in a positive way? It shifts then to the conversation with Katie. One is the outcome of the research study, which is newsworthy, but it's got a shelf life to it. But then it's around actual understanding the audiences within Katie's world and starting to show impact on their changed behaviors and what it looks like in the world. And almost we ran something called the social experiment, which was just taking kind of 3 families from across 3 different segments of our market and running with proper dietitians and meal planners and sports coaches and all of those kind of things within their world, and starting to see how we could influence behaviors and measure those behaviors at a real human level. And I think the insight there is critical. We created stuff that was newsworthy by investing in doing so. And then we understood that it had to be told in various ways across various channels for it to have the legs that it needed to do. And what it wasn't was a one-hit press release or a phone call to Katie to say, please do an interview with X so that we can talk about the report. It's got a shelf life to it. And it's actually the deliberate design of work that says, how do I show up in the conversations that I really want to be having?
The deliberate design of work. And it sounds so easy on a kind of a webcast like this. But we know that in this kind of ad space that we find ourselves, it is so brief to brief. And it's quite an interesting approach, I think, that a marketer has to take around trying to weave themselves into the narrative, trying to even weave the media that they're creating into the narrative through the creative that they're doing. But when you get it right, it feels like it actually means something. Katie, how would you quantify making an impact as a brand in 2023? What does that mean? I mean, I mean, from your perspective, in terms of swaying you, when it comes to brands and their sort of marketing collateral, what do you think the ingredients are that get Katie to go and buy something from a store because she saw it somewhere or heard about it somewhere?
Katie, the regular human, not Katie, the editor and journalist.
Both. Hopefully they're not that far apart.
Yeah, they're not. No, they're not that far apart. I mean, the regular part of me that's just going to walk into a shop and make a decision, and the part of me that is an editor are actually a bit aligned. You know, there was a story some time ago. It was a news story, and it was about a brand, a water brand, that was owned by a company in KZN that was linked to really serious allegations of abuse and rape, and it was a lot. So Katie, the ordinary citizen, can't ignore what Katie, the editor and the journalist, has read about and assigned. So there was, in that instance from me, a very, very conscious decision that says, we don't drink that water at home. We just don't drink that water. So yeah, there's a connect there for me. And I think if brands are just seen as ethical and doing the right thing and having humanity at the center, that's what drives me as an individual. You know, I don't think it's scientific at all. And we've got the marketers and the agency heads on this call, and they're the ones who, from a scientific perspective, will be able to say, you know, she's talking a crock of whatever. But this totally unscientific view of mine is that.
Marvin, there's a question on the chat from Mike. Mike says, does this mean that brands should have one agency partner? And I guess that what that speaks to is to get everyone on the same page, they kind of probably need to be in the same building. And a lot of the time, brands will have sort of several different organizations doing several different things, and sometimes weaving that golden thread and that connectedness is a very challenging thing to do, especially when you want to do what Dustin's talking about, which is kind of have this firm view that you hold true. So in terms of that actual literal, I guess, procurement side of things, does it help when you've got everyone kind of in the same building?
It definitely does. It definitely does. And I think on many layers, firstly, you know, the disconnect between agencies sometimes is actually palpable, whereas within the group, you're actually all in it for the same reason. We do share quite a lot of our clients actually with the group, and you know, Dustin can talk to some of the successes that we've already had. But essentially, the power of one is quite it's an attractive tool for clients these days. And it used to be this way back in the day, where media agencies were actually part of, you know, the creative team, and that for us works quite substantially well. We've seen it, as I said, with, you know, the likes of Lexus that represent Anglo with Dustin and Reza and his team. So it's definitely something that needs to be considered and a focus for us.
Dustin, does it help?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think it also comes down to personalities. And I think where the benefit comes in is an alignment in the way of work and the way of thinking. And I think that helps to streamline processes in a way that just makes the more focus on the work and less focus on the process. And I think that's hugely important in terms of getting the work out. But I think it's also about an alignment of spirit. And I think that's a hugely important issue that often gets left unsaid, because everybody can do the work and everybody can hopefully do the work well. And I think the reality is the orientation is important, and the reason and the humanity that sits behind the people, I think, is an absolutely brilliant but probably largely unsaid part of the conversation around why it becomes better.
We're starting to round out our conversation, so just taking one or two more questions from the live chat. Spoo says, Katie, how should I balance advertorials versus my general paid media? And I guess possibly that question speaks to how effective is an advertorial in a newspaper, because you're not the article, you've got that word advertorial above it, and you could be putting that money into a billboard. So how do you think one should make that decision?
So, you know, it's It's something that I would always advocate for, to go that advertorial route, only because I think that the media needs our support. Because if we're going to have strong media in South Africa, and I've always believed that, strong and healthy media is very closely aligned to a democracy, to a strong and healthy democracy. So if we've got a really strong media that is able to sustain itself, and we don't see newsrooms retrenching and closing down, which we've seen tragically over the years, actually, then I would say, go the advertorial route. And I mean, no disrespect to colleagues in the billboard industry, but really think about, as brands, how you're also going to support the South African media in this landscape, because that's important, because that is your contribution to democracy, actually. That is your contribution to a free South Africa, where we can have media freedom, where we can build strong newsrooms and are able to fund strong newsrooms, where we've got solid journalists. Aria, I can't underestimate, and for this question from Spoo as well, I can't underestimate the importance of having well-funded newsrooms, because it's very, very difficult. And so the result of that is you see juniorization. The result of that is you don't see niche journalists. They don't have a particular beat, because everyone suddenly is everything. And it's good in one respect, but it also dilutes the quality of some of our journalism in other respects. So my answer will always be, do your bit for democracy, actually. Support South African media.
Dustin, how do you and Marvin have this conversation when he's trying to get all the money onto the billboard and you're trying to get some of it into the advertorial?
There's two really important things here. And just to maybe add to what Katie was saying, is I agree. And I think it's the advertorial route is not a bad route if strategically it is the right reason for going that route. My counsel, though, to the client would be is write the copy for that advertorial like you're writing the front page of the business day. So there's no kind of self-smacking on the back moment here. It's actually around something that makes it newsworthy and is in the style and the tone and the place where it is, because it's going to show up better and perform better. In that, and it's going to just be a better piece of content. And if you're smart, you can even use it as a press release later. But the reality is the conversation with Marvin and I would never be around whether the advertorial is the right route or whether the billboard is the right route. The conversation for Marvin and I, and it goes a little bit to the one you asked us earlier around being in one place, is what are we trying to achieve for the client and what is the best way for us to do it, knowing that we might come from different parts of the conversation, but how do we show up best? And whatever channel you choose to do it as damn well as you can. So if it's an advertorial, it's got to be a piece that could win a Pulitzer Prize. It can't be a bunch of "we're so great." Make sure you've got the TM next to the name of the logo every time you write it. It's actually got to be as if you're writing a news piece. That's good advertorial. That means people are actually going to likely engage it and read it and use it. And you never know. Katie might say, actually, this is quite a nice story. I might want to actually run it into my newsroom.
Very, very quickly, Marvin, and then Katie, maybe just close out this advertorial versus billboard conversation that's probably offended a few people. Marvin?
No, and I think one thing that a lot of agencies have seemed to have forgotten is actually the role of each of these channels, right? And we're talking channels, we're talking about paid for media channels, because it wouldn't just be, and as Dustin rightly said, it's not about who gets the bigger budget, but it's more around what's the role that each of these channels are going to play. And then make that decision very strategically that this contributes for X, and then what would billboards contribute for Y. And that was just one point I wanted to add to that.
Katie, close us out.
My last point is very much with my editor's hat on, is to say, if you go the advertorial route, and this is for editors and journalists, you've got to tell your audience. You have a responsibility to be ethical, to tell your audience, this is a paid for, this isn't something that we've just generated as part of our newsroom.
Well, we have to close our conversation and take final thoughts. We started this conversation with Katie scaring us and telling us what we know is true, which is that we're in a news cyclone. Dustin was telling us, well, it's still all about the storytelling. And then Marvin brought in the great news, which is that 85% of ads are actually just being wasted anyway. It is, though, in the intersection of the three vantage points that the three of you hold that the magic Pollard stuff happens because it's newsworthy, it speaks to a purpose which Dustin has interrogated. Marvin can take it and it's an effective piece of creative when you start putting it into a paid environment, but it's not like that just happens overnight. So as we take closing thoughts, perhaps the final question to each of you in sort of 60 seconds or less per person is how do we get to that sweet spot where the three of you can play nicely together if I am the brand manager? Katie, I'll start with you.
Play nicely in the sandpit and don't kill each other. I think that's the key. How do we get to the sweet spot? It's about understanding each other's roles. We've each got different roles, and it's about acknowledging that. It's also about building the relationship and really just acknowledging where we're all coming from. So sometimes we'll get to that sweet spot. Sometimes we won't, and that's also okay, because it makes for very healthy dialogue. So I think we just need to keep talking. We just need to keep nurturing these relationships. And where it works, it's fabulous. And where it doesn't, let's all be accountable and let's answer.
And Marvin, we really have to find the sweet spot because 85% of advertising being ineffective and a waste, it's actually anxiety triggering. So just, we have to find the sweet spot, right?
And all the more reason now, Aria. I think, ourselves with the likes of Dustin as well as Katie really need to come a little bit more integrated in terms of understanding what that moments are that we can play with. And that cuts across, as I said, above the line as well as digital. So what are the key things that we need to try and do? It's going back to the simple principles, and there's four of them again, and I'll say it now. It's the right message at the right time, the right place, and making sure that the right outcomes are actually spoken to. So a question to walk away with in the session is, for all the marketers, are the people you're reaching actually getting the message? And if not, come and see us.
Dustin, you look like you have the hard conversations. I know that you're the guy that tells the clients that what's news to them isn't news to the audience. But what are some of the other hard conversations that we have to brace to allow the three of these sort of perspectives and these three sort of belief systems and ways in which they work to come together in a really kind of beautiful way?
I think it's simpler and hard all at the same time. And for me, it's this principle of suspend your agenda. And I think that's quite an empowering thing to consider because it means you come in open-minded and open-hearted. And I think that's incredibly powerful. It implies an inherent respect for the person on the other side of the discussion, and therefore probably more willingness on them to actually have that conversation with you. But also it's around understanding that the best outcome is likely to reveal itself that way. And I think you have more honest and more real conversations when you put your agenda at the door and you see where it takes you, because you know what the long-term goal has to look and feel like. And I think it's probably the bravest thing anybody could do, suspend your agenda. Ask yourself, anybody on this webinar today, when last did you do that? See what happens when you do.
Well, they say that respect is earned, but after this conversation, it feels like the conversation is actually what's earned. This has been a Red Zone and Financial Mail discussion brought to you by MNC Saatchi Group South Africa, discussing connections and conversations. 3 viewpoints on the call, and my advice would be to get these 3 people into a room if you want to get to Pollard status. Joining us live during this webcast was Dustin Chick, partner and managing director at Razor PR, Marvin Khausane, managing director at MNC Saatchi Connect, and media thought leader Katie Katapodis. Certainly a lot to think about and certainly a lot to do. And thank you so much for joining us. If you missed any of this, it's all available on demand on the Red Zone and Financial Mail South Africa platforms. Cheers.
Thank you.